Greetings, ghosts. The streaming is hitting. All right. 5, 4, 3.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls of all ages. This is Anthony Marquetta, and I will be your host for today. Ben Wheeler, who is the normal main host, and my co-host is on vacation. Isn't that fun? Today, we have a guest with us, Caroline Furlong. Caroline, why don't you say hi, tell them who you are, all about yourself, all of that fun stuff.
My name is Caroline Furlong.
Sorry,
Story. Oops.
hold on. You're cutting in and out for a moment. Try again. Start over.
Caroline. Recent story was published in Sursova's summer issue this past year. It was titled Lupus One, and it's actually germane to the topic at hand, as it was heavily inspired by one of my favorite animes.
Fantastic.
I live in Virginia and I love the USA.
Perfect. That's everything that we've ever needed. Okay. No, really though. From what I could tell, your microphone is kind of cutting in and out a little bit. Possibly, sometimes it'll work if you just disconnect and reconnect, so I suggest trying that and seeing if that makes it a little bit more consistent. This happens with me all the time too, because I'm streaming off of an old laptop that's not designed for this, so I feel your pain, but give that a shot. Try disconnecting and reconnecting and seeing if that works.
Just did. Does that seem to have helped?
Maybe. Say just do testing 1, 2, 3.
Testing 1, 2, 3.
I think it helped. Okay.
Okay, good.
Sorry, everybody. Sorry, listeners. Our top chat's down to 0. I'm shocked. Our conversation has been so scintillating. That's okay. We'll win them all back. So, the topic today is called Anime's Pulp Revolution. Now, and Megabuster Shepherd says, I hear you. Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate that. That's helpful. So, the topic today is Anime's Pulp Revolution. And what we are going to be talking about today, Megabuster Shepherd says in the chat that anime isn't pulp, but I would argue manga is, which is an interesting comment because a lot of anime is based on manga, but that is not what I mean. So, I'm talking about something somewhat personal and somewhat specific when I refer to anime as a pulp revolution. What I am referring to is if you talk to people who were a part of the pulp revolution when it started, and the reason that they joined it and the reason they're a part of it is that, and it's something, Caroline, that I was talking to you earlier about today, they were people who were reading modern fiction and something fell off. Something was missing. There was something, everything felt very samey. Everything felt very uninspired. It didn't feel like there were a ton of options. But then they started reading the pulps. And they realized that there were types of storytelling that have been completely lost to time, but that used to be incredibly popular. And that really opened their eyes to the different types of stories that could be told. Lost World stories are now basically a dead genre. They used to be incredibly popular. Stories like Tarzan, the original Tarzan series was incredibly popular. A Princess of Mars was at one time argued, I believe, by Ray Bradbury to be one of the most influential books ever written because almost the entire space program claimed that they were heavily inspired by Princess of Mars. And these were things that were simply not being talked about anymore, and they were telling stories about strong fighters and about masculine men and feminine women and dastardly villains and good versus evil, that were just not being told anymore. So, you go through the stages of grief with this, where at first you're kind of angry about it, but then you
Yes.
realize it's all there for you, and then you realize that you could be the person who brings the style of storytelling back. Hence the Pulp
Right.
Revolution, and we get writers like J.D. Cohen, who's putting out great stuff. You as well, I think, are at least in some sense a part of this. Ben, my co-host Benjamin Wheeler, has a great pulpy inspired story. A princess. Oh my gosh! I was gonna call it A Princess of Mars, which is completely wrong. I just blanked on the title, which is terrible. It's a great book. Sorry, Ben. Let me look it up quick.
Chic of Mars.
Chic of Mars.
Chic of
Thank
Mars.
you.
Yeah.
He has a great pulpy inspired book, Chic of Mars.
Mhm.
Very Arabian Nights-esque, which you might not think, oh, how is that pulpy? But that's the thing. The pulp's whole thing was about looking at these older sources of fiction and using them and mixing and matching. Robert Howard was brilliant at this in his Conan stories. He would always give you the sense that these old mythologies were at one time ruling the world, and he would have you portray that in a very subtle way. So
Yeah.
that's when
Yeah.
when I refer to anime as my pulp revolution. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to add that Andre Norton would also fall under this category.
Oh, 100%. He was one of the pulp
yeah.
writers.
She started out as one of the pulp writers. In fact, I think her first published story was The People of the Crater. And I managed to find that one and read it. It's very good. And it carries a lot of the hallmarks of her later Witchworld stories. And one of the things that I remember really falling in love with when I started with the Witchworld was the fact that she went with telepathy as magic, or as part of magic. Up to that point, my experience with telepathy had been pretty much based on the comics, Marvel and DC, where the X-Men have several telepaths. So the 90s animation didn't quite help me understand necessarily at the time how it worked. I got a better idea of it, how it worked later. But there's only so much visual mediums, like cartoons can, and even live action can carry over telepathy. Books and even comic books do it much better. But the whole thing about the comics was it was based in science, and this is where the telepathy comes from. This is how it works. You get to Andre Norton, and it's part telepathy, it's part science. It's a native talent that the witch women have. But a good part of it, actually, and she even states it in the first Witchworld novel, is that the power, with capital P, is fed by your imagination, your will, and the power of belief. So it's outside of you at the same time, it's also inside of you. And you can use it to call upon forces that are greater than you. Now, you can either use it for the evil guys, or you can use it for the good guys. So, but she was, both my parents read Andre Norton, and they gave me one of her Witchworld books. We were doing something, and I spotted it, and I said, "Oh, that looks interesting." So they handed it to me. It was Werehawk. It's one of the and that's apostrophe Were Hawk. It's still my favorite. Because after that, I fell head over heels in love with this. Up to this point, as you say, it was mostly samey stuff. Like
Yeah, I get what you're saying. So the idea that I'm getting at when I talk about, you mentioned that whole thing with Andre Norton and the influence, like that you read her and she opened your eyes to a totally different idea of storytelling. So that did not happen for me with pulps. I have as my partner from Pinkerton's Ghost, Ken Dickinson, would testify, and Ben Wheeler would also probably testify. I have what you might call a short attention span. Since I am not since I tried to be less than a typical millennial all the time, I don't, proudly proclaim my ADD or anything like that. I'm not ADD. I'm not ADHD. I don't have mental illnesses, nor would I be proud of it if I did. but I do have a short enough attention span that I sometimes have trouble reading older works. Probably the oldest thing that I can get through consistently, sit down, read it in one go, are Sherlock Holmes. I have read all of the Sherlock Holmes stuff. It's great, fantastic. Yeah. So,
I'm actually a
as
little
far as
behind on my
pulp
Sherlock.
goes, though, what was that?
I'm actually a little bit behind on my Sherlock.
A little bit what with Sherlock? You're cutting off a little bit.
Sorry, I'm a little bit behind on my Sherlock.
Okay. Yeah, I've read all 60 of the original Conan Doyle stories. They're fantastic, especially The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, and The Sign of Four and The Hound of the Baskervilles, as the novels, are all absolutely fantastic. Uh, the Sign of Four, in particular, I think is underrated. It's really, really crackling. Yeah, which is an old fashioned word, but I think fits for an old fashioned story like Sherlock Holmes. Point is, though, the point I'm trying to make, I'm getting a little bit off topic, is that I never had that moment of reading pulp, and I've tried. I've tried reading A Princess of Mars. My eyes glaze over because I don't have the attention span for some of these older works because of the style that they're written in. It's older, more wordy. Even Tolkien sometimes gets to me. I can push through it, and it's worth it for the marvelous, marvelous stuff that he has. But I do sometimes need to push through Tolkien, at least in The Lord of the Rings. Megabuster Shepherd says you don't like Robinson Crusoe. Perfect example. No, not really. I have nothing. If you describe the plot of Robinson Crusoe to me, then I would tell you that it sounded great, and in theory, I should like it. But when I actually start to read it, my eyes start to glaze over. This was something that I linked in the live chat, the article that I originally wrote that this live stream is kind of based around. Anime is my pulp revolution. Now, when I originally wrote this, which is now several years ago, not several, I thought longer than it was, January 2020, so a little over a year ago, right, year and a half. So, anime is my pulp revolution. When I originally wrote this article, it got a little bit of play and conversation in the pulp revolution circle, mostly mockery. Good-hearted, probably fine. The Princess of Mars, boring. And while I get with Princess of Mars, it's boring. It's the style of writing, specifically. Somebody mentioned originally. They mentioned to me originally that why don't you just make comments? Yeah. Somebody says, I would like to see a Burroughs or Howard anime with like Fist of the North Star style art. That I would probably be into because it's not really the story itself that I find boring. It's the writing style that is hard to sit through. I have the same problem with Homer. I have the same problem with the Aeneid, all of that stuff. So the media that first had that reaction to me, that made me, I watched it or I read it, whichever one you put. In this case, it's watched. And then I said, wow, why are we not doing this anymore? Was with anime. Anime did the same thing for me that the pulp revolution did for a lot of people. And specifically, the anime that triggered my whole change in worldview was, of all things, Death Note. So, for people who don't know Death Note, number one, you're living under a rock. It's extremely famous. It was even made into a Hollywood movie. But Death Note is the story of Light Yagami. He is a typical Japanese high school teenager, maybe a little bit more than typical because he's very popular and very smart. But ultimately, he seems destined for a good but normal life. When, out of the blue, a book falls from the sky called the Death Note, and it has rules written on the inside. If you write someone's name in the book, they die. So, now Light has this book. He needs to decide what is he going to do with it. And he decides that the world is so screwed up and so terrible that he is going to use the book to kill all of the undesirables and make the world a better place. And when criminals start dying off, a cat and mouse game starts between we don't know L's name and we don't know what he looks like. which is imperative because that is how the Death Note works. You could kill someone if you know their name and you know what they look like. And so starts the cat and mouse game between Light and L, and that is Death Note. It is brilliant, especially the first half, as anybody who is a fan of the series will tell you. Yeah, Megabuster Shepherd says the Nier arc doesn't exist. Yeah, I have seen people try and argue in favor of the second half of Death Note when Nier shows up. Alexander, in particular, who is one of my favorite YouTube critics, put together a really strong argument that Nier was actually a good character and that they did a great job. I respect the argument. I think he did good. I still don't buy it. The second half of Death Note's not that great. However, the first half of Death Note is so fantastic. It's so amazing. When I watched it, I had that reaction that the Pulp Revolution people had. I finished Death Note and I said, "What is going on? How come I've never seen anything like this? How long have people been writing stories like this? Like this supernatural thriller thing, this incredibly tense, like Hitchcock style cat and mouse game, but with death gods and things. Like, we could be doing this. Why are we not doing this more? Why are more people not doing this?" That was my reaction to Death Note. And that is the difference to me between Western animation and Western media and anime, and what really started to open my mind to different ideas of storytelling. So, looking at the comments briefly, so Carl Philip Gabler says Wright's been doing some pulpy stuff recently. Yeah, John C. Wright's an extremely pulpy writer. Does pulp have a definition, actually? So, we've had this discussion for a while. The definition of pulp is like the sort of things that were written in the pulps when the pulps were still around. That's it. If it is like the stuff that was written in the pulps, then it is pulp. Megabuster Shepherd says, "I do like Matsuda, though." No, Matsuda's great. And there's a great episode in the... I've heard people criticize the Yotsuba group arc in the first half of Death Note, but the Matsuda episode's terrific. And Carl Philip Gabler says Nier was better in the manga. Yeah, I have heard that some of the plot holes in the anime are not present in the manga, but those plot holes are present in the anime, so they're still open to criticism. The final episode, at least, is good. Although the manga is better. I don't like how they treat they treat Light, with too much respect in the anime. In the manga, he dies like a dog screaming for mercy, and that's exactly how he should have gone. I wish the anime had adapted it the way that the manga had it, but at least the manga ending exists. So, I can appreciate that. You have anything to say?
Well, I hope I sound all right.
I can hear you.
I'm getting a slight echo on my end, but if you're okay, that's good. Andre Norton was my introduction to the written pulp form. But in a way, it kind of goes back earlier than that to the first anime I ever really found superbly entertaining. The first anime I technically saw was Speed Racer, but it was only a couple of episodes because they didn't rerun the original, or if they did, I didn't have the channel. But the first anime that really caught my attention and made me sit up would have been the Zoids anime. There were two that came to the US, and they came in the wrong order. The first one to come in was Zoid's New Century Zero, which is the sequel to Zoid's Chaotic Century. Though those aren't their titles. Well, the Chaotic Century's title in Japan is just Zoids. So the first one to come through was New Century Zero NCZ, and that's basically a sports anime. And in that one, you have teams of people piloting giant mechanical animals. You've got them piloting saber-toothed cats. You've got them piloting lions, shield gliders, and dinosaurs like styracosaurs, T-Rexes. The series introduces a specific type of lion-like zoid called the Liger Zero, which is more alive and more aware and more able to act on his own than other zoids, which are alive and aware, but they're a bit tamer. New Century Zero was a fun show. I loved it. I loved the zoids. They were the big selling point. And of course, at some point after that, later that year, they introduced Chaotic Century in the same time slot where they'd been running New Century Zero. This was a bit jarring, and I didn't like it at first, but I kept getting up and I kept watching the show, and it started to grow on me, especially since up to this point, the battles in New Century Zero had all been resolved within one episode. It didn't have much of a plot. Weekly fights, the stakes were a bit big. You had the Zoid Battle Commission, which ran all the
Are we back, ladies and gentlemen? Can you hear me? All right. In theory, I should be back now. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Caroline. All right,
Yes.
so you can hear me. Because I've noticed that my thing wasn't working, which I think is the reason. So I think that was the reason that we were not working on YouTube, because it was me who was being streamed. I think. These are the perils, people, of using like a 5-year-old laptop to do this stuff on. And if you're wondering, Anthony, you've been complaining about this laptop forever. Why have you not gotten a new laptop yet? Well, it is because I am poor. Really, no other answer. Let me check with the stream to see. Can you hear us yet?
Okay.
We should be back, guys.
Okay.
I don't know. It says rest in peace stream. But
Oh dear.
we should be back. I want to see if they respond though. Megabuster
Okay.
Shepherd is always cool. So he'll tell us the truth.
Okay.
In the meantime, I'm gonna yell at Ben and tell him that you have problems. I just wrote in all caps. Yeah, I don't know. It should work. But Megabuster Shepherd says we're dead silent.
Huh. Darn.
Telling him imagine elevator music. Hopefully Ben starts responding to me soon to try and fix it, but I don't know what we can do because we're both on live stream, and live streams is in theory the one that is streaming. It should be working.
Huh. Oops.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we have to wait for Ben. You
Okay.
can respond. You can respond in the chat. If you'd like, though, because that's what I'm doing.
Nope, don't think I can do that.
If you go on YouTube, you should be able to.
Yeah, I'm on YouTube.
Do you have a
but
YouTube account?
No.
Oh, that would be why. Yeah, never
Yeah,
mind. You would need a YouTube account or a Google account. Carl Philip Gabler says can barely hear, very faint.
Maybe that's an echo. I'm gonna mute myself and then try again.
So,
Huh.
yeah, let me go into the live streams and up the volumes.
Okay.
Settings. Voice and video. Okay, you can hear us now, guys? I just upped my output volume like to full, so if it hurts your ears, sorry about that. Ben is blaming children for the outage. I can go with that. Megabuster Shepherd says we're dead again. Okay, I'm going to say a random phrase. Tell me what you hear. Chat, we're counting on you for this. 1, 2, 3. Go. What did I just say? Also, Caroline, are you there?
I'm still here.
Okay. We're back, guys. This is what happens when Ben is and yeah, Ben, Ben is telling me that I put it all the way up. That's because I did put it all the way up intentionally because we were very faint. Perfect. Thank you, guys. All right. Chat helping us out.
Now I've got to remember where I left off.
You were telling us about Zoid's Chaotic Century.
Yeah, Zoid's New Century Zero was very sports anime. You had the Battle Commission, the Zoid's Battle Commission, which ran it seemed to run the government, but it could have just been based around the Zoid battles. It was hard to tell. And then you had the Backdraft Group, which was not a fan of the rules and specific codes of conduct that the Battle Commission was meant to enforce. So basically, it's like if you took, let's see, the Raiders of the 70s and put them in a football stadium today and told them to attack another team the way they would in their time. They do it and they get penalized up the wazoo for it. The Backdraft was a bit more nefarious than that, but they did not want the rules. They wanted all-out combat, let the strong survive. So they kind of added a slight storyline toward the end of the series for that. Mega Buster Shepard remembers Liger Zero. Good. Nice to know somebody out there remembers Zoids.
I do remember Liger because my sister had a Liger toy and she loved it. And admittedly, it was a very cool toy.
Yeah. He was he was the star of that particular show. Zoid's Chaotic Century was a much bigger story, world-spanning, in a sense. It threw together mecha with Western storytelling, with Western, I should say. I'm a little short on sleep, so I'm not necessarily making sense. But it was where New Century Zero was all fun and games. Chaotic Century was more epic. You had this boy, Van Flyheight, who wanted to be like his dad, a great Zoid pilot. And he ends up in the ruins because he never stays home like his older sister tells him to. In this way, it's a little like Star Wars. They took quite a bit from Star Wars for this because you have the evil Empire and the Republic, the Helic Republic and the Gailos Empire, and they're at war. The battle story in the original comics, because Zoid started out as a toy line before they turned it into a story. But the original story from the battle story manga for the series went into detail. The anime did not bother, so we're never told exactly why the war started. Yes, I remember Mega Buster Shepard. I did pay attention when Zoid's Wild Zero and Zoid's Wild came out. To be honest, I prefer Zoid's Wild Zero, and that one's kind of hard to watch for me, which I'll get into later. But Chaotic Century started with the war between the Republic and the Empire, with the Empire as the aggressor and the Helic Republic as the underdog, and Van is a Republican. So his sister tells him he's supposed to stay home, but he goes out and he pokes around the ruins. And today, in this episode, the first episode of the series, while he's poking around, he's attacked by a pilot in a Scorpion-type Zoid called a Geysak. And he ends up being chased and held in the ruins, where he finds a couple of mysterious pods. One has a special type of Zoid, a small one, not too much taller than a human, T-Rex shaped, called an organoid. And the organoid's main purpose is to fuse with a larger Zoid, enhancing its fighting capabilities, to paraphrase the intro for Zoids. So Van ends up partnering with this organoid, which he names after his father's Zoid, Zeke. And they beat the Geysak pilot and a couple of his partners. But then Zeke goes back to the ruins, and Van assumes that Zeke was born out of the pod. He doesn't realize he was stored there. So he goes to wake up Zeke's brother or sister. It turns out it's neither. It's a girl. A blonde girl who doesn't remember her name, has no idea where she came from. Yes, I remember that too. We'll probably get to it a little later, Mega Buster Shepard. The only thing the girl remembers is the name Fiona. She doesn't even remember what lemons are when she gets to the Van's home, the Wind Colony, and she's pointing at everything, asking him, "What's that? What's that? What's that?" They end up going on a journey that takes them across 2 seasons. Which it's a very great story. Now the thing about Zoids that makes it stand out, I could go on describing the story forever, so I'd better moderate myself. But what made Zoids stand out at the time for me, a lot of the shows that were on when Zoids was on were exceptional. They were very good, especially when you look back at them from this vantage point where we've got the awful She-Ra reboot and the newest He-Man debacle. But they were also products of their time. I don't know, Anthony, did you ever see Gargoyles?
Gargoyles was something that I think that aired when I was young, but I never ended up watching it.
Well, if you ever get the
Just
chance to watch it
and
again,
I've heard nothing but great things about it.
it is good. I did enjoy it, and I still do love it. Don't watch season 3. Don't. Blah. Yuck.
I've heard nothing but great things about Gargoyles. Everybody says it's amazing, and I'm sure it is. That was one thing. I never watched Gargoyles. I never really watched. I was never really into the DCAU, except for weirdly, of all things, I watched Static Shock, which was probably the worst show of the DCAU.
Mm-hmm.
But I did watch it for some reason. I have no idea why. It was okay. It was kind of proto-woke. Yeah. And in retrospect, my favorite is Batman Beyond.
Yeah.
Because I love the aesthetic and I love the concept of Batman Beyond. And I also love that it was clearly something that nobody had any interest in. That they decided they were going to put the effort into, and they actually made something that was original and great. But at the time, I wasn't really watching any of them except occasionally Static Shock. So all of those, the great cartoons of Western animation when I was younger, just kind of didn't really take part in that whole thing. For no good reason either. I don't even know why.
That's okay. The thing is, there's one episode of Gargoyles, even though I love the series, that I absolutely hated. It was an episode where Puck, because Gargoyles blends Shakespeare with, let's see, Gargoyles blends in Shakespeare a lot with its storytelling. So Puck is one of the characters, and he's very entertaining. He's fine, but there's one episode where he wants a magical artifact that Goliath, the lead gargoyle, has, and he takes Goliath on this vision trip into the future where everybody but Goliath dies. Everybody he cares about. And then Puck is posing as the human who's partnered with the gargoyles and who's fallen in love with Goliath, and Goliath's fallen in love with her. So Puck tries to use her image to get Goliath to give up the magical object, the Phoenix Gate. Goliath finally puts 2 and 2 together at this point and says, "No, I won't. You're not Elisa, the girl." And Puck's disguise, is destroyed, and he ends up talking with Goliath. So we get put through all this emotional heartache watching all our favorite characters but Goliath and Elisa, presumably, until he figures out that it's Puck, die. And Puck says, "Well, yeah, I wanted the magical the Phoenix Gate, because if I'd done it, maybe Father, Oberon, would have let me stay among you mortals just a little longer, because, let me tell you, you're more interesting than the other Fae." But was all this that I showed you real? Or was it just, he ends it off with the line, "Dream or prophecy, I'm not telling. Wake up, Goliath." And then Goliath finally wakes up, because he got knocked out for this, with Elisa trying to wake him up. There were so many variations on that type of story. I hated them so much, because there was another one in Batman the Animated Series where Barbara Batgirl is exposed to Scarecrow's fear drug, and again, it's the same thing. Everybody dies. and you get put through all this emotional heartache for nothing. It does nothing to progress the series. It's just some kind of a what if. I think the most famous episode for this of any series where this type of story was done was Dallas. Did you ever hear about that one?
Oh yeah, the Dallas debacle is one of the most famous and silliest of the "it was all a dream." Everything was a dream storylines. For people
Yeah,
who don't know, retcons in of the show because they killed a popular character.
yeah. And everybody and his brother at the time. It didn't matter if you were talking animation, it didn't matter what show you were watching. Somebody somewhere decided to pull a Dallas. I hated it. It was so depressing and
Yeah, I
upsetting.
agree. It's a weird desire.
So I
People want
kept,
to have their cake and eat it too, I think. Danny Phantom
yeah,
even did an episode like that. Only with Danny Phantom, I think it kind of worked a little bit better because it was like if Danny didn't stop the villain, then this would happen. So there were actual
yeah,
stakes to the story. Like it wasn't just he woke up and then it was all a dream. It
hmm
was like a bad future occurred and now Danny needs to do something or else the future is going to occur. Danny Phantom, by the way, is one of the great under the radar superhero shows from of a slightly later era. It was in like the
hmm
early 2000s, so a little bit past. I think it might have been at the tail end of the DCAU, maybe. I'm not even sure. But it was a little bit past the heyday of the DCAU. But Danny Phantom was an unironically excellent show in its own right. Uh, and it kind of it only went 3 seasons, but it kind of got a cult following out of it, which I think is well deserved. And I remember that episode being one of the best episodes, and that was I don't remember all of the details of it because it's been so kind of on brand. And like
yeah,
in the evil version of the future, like the world ends or something. The thing is, though, I think this elevates itself as the typical, everybody dies, everything's depressing. It's all just a
yeah,
dream storylines because there were stakes. Like this was
yeah.
something that was going to happen unless
But
Danny stopped it.
right. But the thing too is, it got to be such a pattern that I was expecting this almost out of almost everything I was watching at the time. We get this future where everybody dies. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Zoids didn't do that. Now for New Century Zero, that made sense. It was a sports anime. It was lighthearted and fun. It was not going anywhere. There were no real super stakes. There were stakes every now and then, and toward the end they added some impressive ones, though not to the degree that I would say it was high adventure. But Zoids never did that. I was expecting throughout both seasons for something like that to happen. The closest we get is the episode The Devil of the Sea, where one of the new villains, it's a girl named Reese. She shows Fiona, who's older now, because Van and Fiona start out the story at 14. By the second season, Guardian Force, they're roughly 18, give or take. And they've made this new enemy, Reese, who's slightly older. And Reese hates Fiona. She has a special grudge against Fiona. She doesn't like Van either, but she hates Fiona. And this is the episode where we get a hint about why. In this episode, Fiona ends up separated from Van. And she's on a cliff because they went out swimming. And she's been separated from Van, so she's got to wait for the tide to come out to try and get back on land. Unbeknownst to both her and Van, Reese has been in the area causing trouble. So Reese knows they're there. And she knows Fiona is separated from Van, who's trying to find her, but he doesn't think there's any major problem, so he's just calling her name, wandering through the woods like, okay, she's around here somewhere. Fiona sits down to wait, be patient. She's pretty good at that. Reese shows up and says, "Do you know the meaning of your name?" And now this isn't what Fiona actually means. It's probably what the translation of her Japanese name means, which is "the end is near." And Reese is a psychic. Fiona is too, but not to the same degree and not as practiced in the same arts as Reese is. Because Reese gets in your head and messes with you. So she puts two fingers to Fiona's head and says, "Take a look at your future, Fiona." And Fiona sees zombies essentially coming up out of the water to try and get her. Only for Van to step in front of her. Van's the hero of the show. He's always come through for her. But he gets shot. Now they cut out the blood because this was the time when anime was getting censored a lot. And one of the things they would censor out was blood. But Fiona sees him shot. And of course she reacts accordingly because she and Van have fallen in love since, not long after the series started. And in a way, it's clear it's not the future. Reese is messing with her. You're a little worried, or at least I was, because I'd noticed this pattern throughout all the other shows I was watching at the time. But we find out later that Reese was not showing Fiona the future. And she wasn't just messing with her head. She hates Fiona because Fiona has what she lost. Reese and Fiona are both ancient Zoidians. They are members of the race that originally inhabited Z. Humans are new. They came to Z via explanation. A little like He-Man from the 1980s, where his mom is from Earth. And this is one of the things that I think I really appreciate about anime, and I think that's one of the things that makes them a little more pulpy than modern stuff. It's how they handle their characters. Reese is sorry, you first.
No, I was just going to say I completely agree with you. It's one of the reasons that I admire My Hero Academia so much. The word that I keep going back to with that story particularly is sincerity. And it's something that you see really in all. It's how sincere they are in telling their story. But go ahead, finish what you're saying about Zoids first, because My Hero Academia is a rabbit hole. So finish out the Zoids discussion first.
But one of the other things that Zoids did very interestingly, redemption stories are everywhere, and we had them at the time too. They were somewhat weaker though. I'm not entirely sure I can articulate it now. They've gotten weaker since, where my go-to example right now is the Ultimate Spider-Man finale, where they redeemed Doc Octopus almost out of nowhere. Spidey's been working on him, we're supposed to believe, throughout the entire 4-season series. And at this moment, Doc Ock has this 180-degree turn. That trend hadn't caught on quite as much at the time, but it was not exactly ham-fisted, but it wasn't as sincere. We'll go with that for now, as Zoids was. Because we find out in The Boy from the Ruins, which is an episode that comes after The Devil of the Sea. The Devil of the Sea shows us Reese gets knocked out of her Zoid and she's about to drown. So Van wouldn't have let her drown, but Fiona, who ended up psychically connecting with her for a minute, realizes what Reese did to her is a memory of Reese's. Reese was found by a boy, just like Fiona was found by Van. The boy who found Reese, however, Niccolo, lived in a village that was very wary of outsiders. And when the Republican army came knocking because they heard, hey, there's an organoid here, almost every ancient Zoidian has an organoid partner. So organoids are highly sought after because they increase the power of the specific Zoid. If you can tame one, then you increase your power considerably. And if you get an organoid for your best pilot in the army, well, it's kind of the equivalent of having a railgun when everybody else has Garand M1s. You're going to win, and the other guys are going to be hurting. And the Republic is the underdog, as I said, in the fight. So Niccolo was the only one who didn't want to turn Reese and her organoid partner Specula over to the Republic. He was the only one who fought. Everybody else in town skedaddled. And Niccolo paid for it. He was killed. We don't know exactly what happened to Reese. She has no problem attacking Imperial targets, but the first time we see her, she mind controls an entire village of Republican citizens. She doesn't actually hurt them. And from what we see at the end, for most of them, it's just like, oh, wow, we spent the night in a cave. Well, that was weird. But the captain of the soldiers, who happens to be a friend of Van, and somehow she gets inside your head and drives you mad. The soldiers didn't get off so easily, and this episode explains why. I'm still very much in awe of how they redeemed Van's main antagonist in the series. He's not the big bad guy. I like to say he's the Winter Soldier of Zoid pilots, and this is Raven, where Van is this hyperactive, hey, let's go on an adventure! I love Zoids, aren't they cool? They're these giant cats and dogs and dinosaurs, and they're partners for life because Zoids are alive. Which is another theme of the series that gets hammered home throughout, because most people treat Zoids as either pets or tools or weapons, which is kind of a direct quote from the series. But Van was one of the few people who says, no, they're more than that. They're living creatures, and they deserve to be treated with the same kind of respect you would treat a cat or a dog or a horse with. You don't beat up the horse unless you're a horse beater, and nobody liked horse beaters. Raven, when we first meet him, is an absolute terror. First time we see him, he's piloting a blood red Saberfang, which is a saber-toothed tiger Zoid. Now, the first time we see him fight, he's not necessarily fighting the most impressive Zoids in the entire Republican army. These are Iguanodon-type Zoids called a Godos. G-O-D-O-S, for the curious. And they're cannon fodder Zoids. You see them get knocked all over in every battle. You don't see blood or guts. The Zoids just get shot. And you know that, okay, the Zoids are down, the pilots are probably okay. Little kids, you don't think about anybody dying in the cockpit. Until you see Raven go up against a detachment of at least 30 Godoses. He rips off arms, he rips off legs, he puts them down on the ground, and with one particular twist of the paw, pops the head off. It's the most brutal fighting style scene, and I think it takes place in episode 8 or 9. It's the episode with the same name as him, Raven. It's scary as heck, because up to this point in the series, if you're new, Van's been in some scrapes. The battles have been dangerous, and they've been getting a bit more dangerous. He's been in one major conflict between the Empire and the Republic. but it doesn't necessarily look like anything he can't handle until he meets Raven, who decimates these guys. These are Republican soldiers. Now, granted, they're fighting in cannon fodder Zoids, and the most anybody, which Raven points out, the most anybody in the armies of both sides seems to know how to do is pull the trigger. They don't maneuver, they don't utilize the Zoid strengths. Raven hates Zoids, but he's learned how to utilize his Zoid strengths to the maximum. And the further on you go throughout the series, when he gets newer Zoids, like the Genosaur and the Genobreaker, the more the carnage increases. Now again, you don't necessarily see the pilots die. The Genosaur and the Genobreaker have a special type of weapon called a charged particle cannon, which acts like Godzilla's atomic breath. So you see the screen, the outlines for the animated characters fade and dissipate because they're being evaporated. But it's not graphic. You can watch it and go, okay, well, yeah, he's dead. But that doesn't leave off the impression of Raven is brutal. He is terrifying, and the most terrifying thing about him is he enjoys it. He enjoys flaunting his skill, flaunting his strength. He enjoys being stronger and being able to kill everybody, which is the exact opposite of Van. He's the photo negative, to paraphrase the Russo brothers or whoever said it about Bucky, for Cap.
Right. So the idea.
So you basically,
go ahead.
You basically hate him throughout the entire series until you get to the episode "The Distant Stars," and "The Distant Stars" has Raven have an encounter with Reese, where she uses her psychic powers to make him relive the worst moment in his life. And it turns out Raven was the son of Zoid researchers. And the reason he hates Zoids at first, and it's not a passionate hatred, he doesn't want to destroy anything at this point, he's like 9. But he hates them because his parents don't seem to have time for him. If they didn't have Zoids around, they would have more time for me, right? Then his parents are researching an organoid. This organoid is, we see him again later, and he does not belong to a nice guy. He is released from his pod and he kills Raven's parents. And it turns out Raven's found later by a Republic detachment. And guess who's leading the detachment? Van's father, Dan Flyheight. And in this battle, they come to the battle where Van's father dies because they found an organoid, and one of the big villains of the series comes to claim the organoid. Van's father is forced to fight, and he destroys the Imperial detachment, but he is killed in the process. Raven decides to go and seek revenge, and he is taken by the big bad guy because he doesn't know enough about guns that to realize he's got the safety on the gun he stole from one of the soldiers. And the big bad guy takes him. Sorry, I should give you his name. His name is Prozer. He takes him and he trains him to be a weapon. And he tempers and strengthens Raven to the point that he becomes this ruthless killer. And after that, the hatred that I had for Raven, because I hated him, and I didn't want him in the series anymore, it tapered right off because it shows you where he came from. And they do this. I'm going to try and segue into some of the other anime series I was thinking of. But they do this with a lot of different villains. And they do it in a very sincere and organic way that you don't see a lot in the West. Which again, even with this time of great shows like Batman, the animated series, Batman Beyond, they didn't quite do it the same way. I'm not entirely sure how to say it.
No, I do. I understand what you mean, kind of. So, There
Mhm.
is a show that was a little bit after the DCAU era, I believe. I don't remember the exact year, and I'm not going to look it up because everything is working slowly on my computer right now, and that is just as liable to crash something as anything else if I try and research it. But I talked to you about it earlier in the chat. Avatar: The Last Airbender. Some people
Yes.
would argue that it is an anime because it is made in Korea. I would not. So I
Mhm.
also don't think it's really that important. The main point I'm making, Avatar: The Last Airbender is a beloved show, right? And
Mhm.
it is a very good show. Don't get me wrong.
Mhm.
I think it is good. I enjoy it. It was solidly made from start to finish. Good animation, good writing, good characters. It was good. But Avatar: The Last Airbender,
Mm.
in my opinion, and this is a little bit controversial, has a little bit of an outsized reputation in the West, I think. Uh, it is one of the most beloved shows ever made, honestly. I believe on ratings it's in the top 10. Like, it's a much loved show, and really deservedly when you look at what it was up against. In my opinion,
Yeah.
the reason that Avatar is so beloved in the West is because it is the first shonen anime made for a Western audience, made specifically for a Western audience. I don't think Avatar is perfect. My main gripe with Avatar is that the characters are distinct and the characters are memorable and they are consistent, but they come across as modern teenagers who should not be in the setting that they're in. Katara and Sokka. Katara
Mm.
mentioned sexism in episode 1. Why doesn't the Inuit culture of magical water, where some of the people randomly have magical water powers, even have a concept like sexism? Like, why is that
Yeah.
something that would come up? Well, because they're modern teenagers, so it does come up for the people who would be watching the show, maybe. Uh, it also has a couple of very special message episodes that are very ham-fistedly done. Some of the proto-woke stuff, which I think is another reason for its longevity. Why the SJW crowd hasn't dropped it or canceled it. Korra, of course, is another reason, but I'm going to completely ignore Korra here. It's a separate thing and
Yeah.
it's terrible. There's really, if you want to know why it's terrible, uh, then watch ER's series on it. It's great, very entertaining, and he goes into all of the reasons that Korra is garbage and that the original Avatar: The Last Airbender is good. Megabuster Shepherd says Avatar: The
Mhm.
Last Airbender suffers from Whedonisms. Yes, it does, and it suffers from them in the worst type of way. In that, at least when Whedonisms work, they work because they fit the setting that they're in. Like Buffy the Vampire Slayer is actually teenagers at a high school. Now, I don't think Buffy the
Yeah.
Vampire Slayer is a perfect show, but at least its ultra feminist philosophy sort of fit the setting that it was in. Firefly too, for that
Mhm.
matter. Firefly is set in a futuristic sci-fi Western world, and they sounded like they were from that area. Yes, everybody was almost unnaturally quippy and, good at talking, but hey, you want to write entertaining dialogue. I think it works fine. Avengers, it's mixed effect. I think it works more often than
Yeah.
it doesn't. Uh, Sometimes, though, there definitely are too many Whedonisms, especially, people criticized Ultron for this, and I think that that's fair. But I do think it worked more often than it doesn't. Avatar: The Last Airbender, this was a particularly big problem because Avatar: The Last Airbender was supposed to be set in a pseudo-medieval Asiatic world, and Katara and Sokka did not act like they were a part of that world at all. Specifically, those two. Uh, Aang as well really didn't fit that great. Zuko, on the other hand, was great. Zuko was a fantastic character, easily the best part of the show
Yeah.
and the best remembered part of the show. He was unironically a fantastic character with fantastic development. Very well done. Uncle Iroh as well.
Yeah.
That whole side of the plot was great. It's also something that you just don't see nowadays. He was a villain. He was essentially raised to be a Nazi. In one of the absolute
Yeah.
best episodes of the show, you think that Zuko might join the Team Aang and the Avatar, and then he turns on them because he
Mhm.
still is a Nazi. That was his goal all along. It's gonna take a lot to change that, right? And eventually he does, but they really put the work in for it. It's great. But my point is that Avatar: The Last Airbender, I think the reason it was so popular is just because it was a shonen anime that hit a lot of those shonen anime tropes. Steven Universe, by the way, does as well. In fact, Steven Universe is even more aggressive about its anime influences, to my understanding of it. I haven't seen it. My sister has. I've watched reviews because I have a problem. Uh, but my sister has seen it. And this is what she tells me. She insists to me that it is. By the way, she did not like it. But anyway, she insists to me that it wears its anime influences even more on its sleeve. And I sort of get. And, I think, though, that Steven Universe did not have the cultural impact of Avatar. Number one, Avatar came first. Number two, Steven Universe just wasn't as good. It was big among the SJW crowd and nobody else. SJWs adored it. Probably young kids who grew up with it, I'm sure, liked it. But nobody else liked it. Avatar: The Last Airbender was a by-the-numbers shonen, above average. It was good. I don't really like doing number ratings, but I'd give it a thumbs up. But I could think of at least 5 anime shonen that are better than it off the top of my head that will give you a lot of the same things that you're looking for. Particularly Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, I think, hits a lot of the same sorts of beats that Avatar: The Last Airbender does, but it is better, I think, in literally every way. I actually cannot think of an aspect of the production of Avatar: The Last Airbender in any part of it that is better than Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, except arguably the pacing of the first 16 episodes. Maybe.
Yeah.
And that's a stretch.
Maybe.
Even that is a big stretch. I will give Avatar this, it is paced well. Again, I'm not coming here to bury Avatar.
Yeah.
My point is that, and also Megabuster Shepherd says, Megabuster Shepherd, by the way, says, great characters, settings, and world building, terrible dialogue, very hit or miss humor. Yes, I think that that's a fair take. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Some of the characters in it are great. Iroh is great. Boomy is great. I think Toph, I think, works very well for what she is. The characters are all distinct and they're all memorable and they're all very well characterized. That's not an issue. And Megabuster Shepherd says the Fire Nation was expressly based on Imperial Japan, as per the writers. Yes, it comes through. I think it's clear.
Yeah.
So, point I'm making, though, is that you could get a lot of, the stuff that you would get out of Avatar: The Last Airbender. Honestly, I would just tell someone, if they only have time for one show, watch Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. It will give you much of the same things that you're looking for. The sprawling, the large cast, the camaraderie, the sprawling plot, the brilliant animation, all of that stuff, except just better. Everything about it is just better. And I would probably rank Yu Yu Hakusho above it. I would rank Hunter x Hunter, which I don't even think is perfect, but is very good and can reach moments of brilliance. I would rank Hunter x Hunter above it. I would rank Magi above it. Now, granted, I'm the only person in the world who actually thinks Magi is brilliant. It's tends to have a reputation as a kind of middle of the road shonen, and I adore Magi. I think it's a great show. But, even if it is middle of the road, middle of the road show, Hero Academia, I mean, I know season 5 isn't that great, and season 4 was hit and miss. But My Hero Academia, the manga, has been absolutely on fire lately. Been incredible, and My Hero Academia is considered about as bog standard of a shonen as you could possibly get, right? It hits all of the standard shonen tropes. And it hits them very formulaically. You got the main character who wants to be the very best like no one ever was. You have his rival who is kind of a jerk but who wants the same girl and who works as a foil. You have the kind and cute love interest in Ochako. I mean, all of these different tropes. Mentor figure in All Might. You have the foil villain in Shigaraki. All of these tropes it hits. And it hits them really very dead on. It's not a whole ton of deviation from them. It's just that My Hero Academia, I think, has kind of honed the system down to perfection in some ways. So that, as an insult in itself, I just mean that of the many good points of My Hero Academia, I would not call it overly original. Like, it has many great qualities, but originality is not one of them. And I know people will say originality is overrated, but there is something to, the idea of, I want to see something a little bit different. Like Hunter x Hunter is wildly original and creative, and I think that is to its credit, even though I'm not a huge Hunter x Hunter guy. Avatar is very bog standard in the same sort of way, but it's just not executed as well. That's what I mean. There's with anime, for me, it was like I mentioned it with Pulp Revolution when people saw the pulps and they realized what they were missing, and you almost get this moment of like kind of irrational anger. And that was sort of my feeling when I started experiencing more and more anime and going, look at the sorts of stories that they're telling. Look at like what they're doing, stuff that I never would have dreamed of, that you never ever see in the West. In the West, animation is two things. It is children's media or it is adult comedy. And that is basically it. Very, very rarely you will get something different, like the most recent He-Man series. And I think there was some sort of alien show from, earlier in the 2000s. I can't recall the name of it off the top of my head.
That might have been Titan AE.
No, Titan AE was it was a kids movie, and I remember it. Whedon was incidentally. Oh, by the way, going into the comments again briefly, Megabuster Shepherd says I would tell them to watch Hellsing. I don't think that you're going to get exactly the same thing out of Hellsing as he would out of Avatar. Havocbringer says Magi is one of my favorite anime manga. Thank. So, C. Wright once wrote an article, basically agreed with him in the article, and I've written like a couple of different articles on Magi and why I think Magi is actually a brilliant show. Alibaba is one of my favorite characters ever. What was the name of the villain from the Magnustat arc of Magi? I can't recall off the top of my head. Havocbringer, if you can remember his name, the headmaster of the school. One of my favorite quote-unquote villains, because he's not even really a villain ever. Basically, they get like magical Hitler and they kind of make him a good guy, and you sort of like him, and you sort of agree with him. And I thought it was just absolutely brilliant writing and social commentary, the way that it avoids giving you an easy answer to difficult questions. Megabuster Shepherd says, again, I like One Punch Man better, couldn't get into MHA, sorry. I've heard that a lot. MHA, Season 1 is mostly set up of Deku, because it tries to get you invested in Deku as the main character. Season 2 is where it really breaks out, because that's where it sets up the world. And it sets up the other characters. And that's also where you start to see that Horikoshi is actually really, really brilliant at character writing. Like that. Secretly, MHA, the greatest strength of My Hero Academia is the character writing. Wow, I'm kind of disappointed I can't remember the name of the headmaster of the school in Magi, because he's an awesome character, and it's right on the tip of my tongue, but I can't remember it. Either way, basically, so what I'm referring. Go ahead.
No, I was thinking about Avatar: The Last Airbender too after you mentioned it in chat, and I wonder. Excuse me. But I do wonder if they're very sincere in how they imitate the forms of anime, shonen anime. And I love Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'm not trying to bury it either. But there's a certain sincerity. Let's go with that again. That Avatar: The Last Airbender seems to be missing. It's
I think
it's almost like they're I don't want to pick on them, but it's almost like they're cosplaying Japanese
So I get what you're saying.
story
I think
tropes.
the most sincerity is present
And
with Zuko,
yeah, the closest
which is why Zuko is the most memorable.
Zuko and Iroh, they nail
Yes.
them. And I wonder, this is just something that crosses my mind every now and then, and it's based on things I hear about other media out of Hollywood or elsewhere. I wonder how much the producers or the editors might have had to do with that, because, and this gets to both the Superversive and the Pulp Rev points, where you get gatekeepers, and they say you have to have this type of character, you have to have this type of thing. Maybe they wouldn't have had Katara mention sexism in the first episode if they didn't have expectations that this has to be said, otherwise the gatekeepers will not be happy. In Japan, they don't have those type of gatekeepers. They have editors. One of the shows that I really love, and I think it hits many of the same, shonen tropes that Avatar was aiming for. And it might be something that MHA lovers or people who couldn't get into My Hero Academia would be interested in, is Avengers Disc Wars, which it is like, it's also a bog standard, and I say that complimentarily, shonen trope. You have the standard Avengers, 5 in particular. They select 5 for the main cast: Captain America, Iron Man, Hulk, Wasp, and Thor. And Tony, Iron Man, has been working with this Japanese scientist, Dr. Akatsuki, to make a new type of villain trap called a DISC, Digital Identification Securement Kit. And it digitizes the villain and puts them in a little disc you can fit the palm of your hand. Tony's bright idea is to throw a party for the revelation, to reveal this design to the world, because Dr. Akatsuki has 2 sons he hasn't seen in 2 years, working with Tony on this. And of course, remembering his own fraught relationship with his father, Tony wants to do something to help Dr. Akatsuki reconnect with his boys after 2 years away. So he throws a big bash so that he can invite the kids over to meet their dad. He holds the bash on the equivalent of Riker's Island, the raft, which in the show is above water. Of course, chaos ensues, and the heroes end up digitized in discs. So the kids, the boys, and 3 other kids, Americans, well, the girl lives in France, so maybe her citizenship is a little up there, end up with these 5 Avengers discs, and they end up partnering with them. Someone I know calls the show Avengers Pokemon. But it's very much like MHA in that they focus on, they take the world of Marvel Comics and they run with it. The MCU, when I saw this first, Disc Wars was, I think it had gotten 1 season and they were halfway through season 2. That's when I found it. And the MCU was going pretty strong and it was enjoyable, but I was paying attention to the comics at the time. And those were depressing. And the animated show we had, which was Avengers Assemble at the time, was also depressing in that it was getting the characters wrong, fundamentally wrong. They were not sincere. That was their version of Captain America was not the sincere version of Captain America. We'd had a much better show previously from 2011 to 2012 called Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, which was sincere in how it portrayed the characters. They lined up with their original comic book counterparts. There were some variances. They've made a few tweaks to fit it into the modern world.
I mean,
But for the most part, these were the characters that Stan Lee
Yeah, exactly.
had
I
made
mean,
all
I'm
those
just
years ago. And
thinking
Discourse
about. Go ahead, finish what you're saying.
Discourse carried that over in a very standard shonen format. So my thought is that if you're a newcomer coming to anime, then Discourse might be one of the good entrance points because it overlaps with Avatar: The Last Airbender in that you've got kids saving the world with superpowers. Literally, they've got a superhero in their wristwatch. So the characters in the world is familiar, but you get the overlay of Japanese sincerity and Japanese storytelling with the transition to adulthood. And this is something that I was also thinking about today, and it relates to the sincerity aspect. One of the things, and I'm dipping back into Zoids real quick here, is that Japanese shonen heroes, or heroes in most of the anime I have seen, they will have their core values and beliefs challenged at some point. Toward the end of the first season in Zoids, Van meets Prozen in the episode called The Doom Machine. And Prozen tries to give him the relativistic spin. You and I are no different. We've all hurt people. It's the rhythm of life, is what he actually says. Each of us must sacrifice others to get what we want. And he succeeds in befuddling Van until Fiona puts her foot down and says, "No, you're not the same. What you two are trying, what you're doing, Prozen, is completely different from what Van is trying to do." And that still sticks with me today. And I've noticed it as a pattern throughout anime. Is you've seen it in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood. Kimberly, that's his name. He challenges Ed and says, "What? You signed up to be a
in
dog of the military?"
Alchemist Brotherhood, in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, they are challenged all the time on their beliefs. What makes Ed and Al, specifically Ed, because Al is kind of going with Ed's lead on things more than anything. But what makes them admirable is the fact that they have this core belief that even when everything around them is crumbling, that they absolutely refuse to give up. The best scene, in my opinion, in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and my favorite episode of any show, probably ever, certainly any anime ever, maybe any show ever, is from my favorite episode of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, Death of the Undying. And Death of the Undying is one of the most quotable and the most intense episodes of any show you'll ever see. It is. I remember it very fondly because when I watched it, when I watch things, I tend to have writer brain on all the time. Any writer will tell you. You're always analyzing, you're always thinking, you're always looking at what can and can't work. And Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood turned that part of my brain off. Specifically in this episode, I was so fully engrossed in the moment that I was not. I was gasping at plot twists. I was completely caught up in what was going on. And in the scene that I'm referring to, this is at the end of the episode, Colonel Mustang supposedly, and I'm going to spoil it, but we're like over a decade now, so get over it. So Colonel Mustang has just been supposedly killed by Lust. We see him get stabbed. He's bleeding out on the ground. Havoc is also supposedly dead. Lust marches in. Hawkeye, when she realizes that Mustang is dead, loses it, empties her clip into Lust, and of course it does nothing. And Lust is about to kill her. And then Al steps in front of Hawkeye. And Hawkeye is broken. She is a husk. She tells Al just to leave her there to die. And Al says, "I absolutely refuse. I'm sick of watching people die. Not when I could do something to help it." And this is a turning point in the series. For the eagle-eyed viewer, you will notice that Ed and Al are much more successful in fights after this episode. And of course, this is the famous moment of the episode where Mustang shows up, having cauterized his own wound with the lighter that he held in his pocket, and he takes on Lust in one of the most badass scenes in all of shonen anime.
Oh yeah.
Brilliant scene, brilliant moment, jaw dropping. I remember when Mustang showed up again, I actually like audibly gasped out loud. Like
Mhm.
I legitimately, the show had me. I thought he was dead. Like I
Mhm.
thought that he was dead when he showed up again. Like I was invested. So
Yeah.
this is the sort of thing that you could really only get with a full commitment to your show and your characters, to sincerity. My Hero Academia is another one. And
Yeah.
the My Hero Academia, one of the most famous moments of the show, probably at this point the most famous moment, is the United States of Smash scene, right? Anybody who
Yeah.
knows anything about it knows what I'm referring to.
Oh yeah.
It's one of probably the best anime moment of the decade when it happened. You know, and you want to know something? What makes that scene is that it's an incredibly silly line, and the show takes it so seriously. Like they don't just
Mhm.
take it seriously; they are playing it for emotion. They're playing it for
Mhm.
tears. They want you to tear up watching that scene,
Mhm.
and it's kind of hard not to. Like the
Yeah.
impact of the moment is so great, and everything about it, like it's been built up so well. It's the fact that My Hero Academia means it. All Might's gonna punch a dude while yelling United States of Smash, and an explosion goes off in the background, and you are going to believe that this is important. No matter how silly it doesn't matter that it's silly. Like, is it a silly line? Of course it is. It's an incredibly silly line. I mean, it's a line that's so silly, it's hard to say out of context without laughing. Like, which you
Yeah.
just did, right? You heard it
Yeah.
and you laughed. Out of context, it's silly. In context, it is not silly. You only
Yeah.
think of that afterward. In the moment, I remember, like, the episode came on TV, me and my siblings were watching, and we were discussing the episode and how good it was. And then it hit the climax, that moment when All Might punches All for One and he says the line, and all of us
Uh-huh.
just kind of shut up at the same time because
Mhm.
we were caught up in it.
Mhm.
It was so good, and the reason it's so good is because My Hero Academia is so earnest about what it's doing. And you mentioned about,
Yeah.
challenging belief systems and whatever. These shows, anime has this down to a science, right? It is constantly
Yeah.
doing this. Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is doing this constantly. My Hero Academia is doing this constantly. Characters are set up as foils specifically for this purpose, right?
Yeah.
That's the whole idea behind the concept of a character foil. I mean, My Hero Academia is always challenging the philosophies of the characters, and they're always learning and growing. So I mentioned it
Right.
earlier that it's a generic show, but it's being generic, being original is overrated, which is we all hear a lot. But Digibro, in his pre-mental illness days, he had an excellent video on My Hero Academia, and he made a great point. He said, whenever I talk to people who are really big fans of My Hero Academia, and he liked the show, by the way, like he enjoyed it, but he said, whenever I talk to people who are like really big fans of My Hero Academia, they always tell me the same things about it. And it's always fascinating to me because they say the fights don't go on for more than 2 episodes. The villains don't monologue forever. The hero isn't whiny and annoying or whatever. Basically, they're not praising My Hero Academia for what it is, but just for executing the shonen formula well. Like, My Hero Academia is not doing anything itself particularly good, is taking a pre-used formula and just not messing it up. But
It's kind of
that in
because of
itself
that I think
works.
enhances it.
Yeah, that in itself works. And he said, my point is that the shonen formula itself is really good. People like the shonen formula. There is a reason that it shows up over and over again. There is a reason that it is so popular. My Hero Academia kind of got it down to a science. Demon Slayer, I think, in my opinion, like it actually distilled it even more than My Hero Academia did, but in my opinion, to its detriment. It actually cut out too much. Like I think that Demon Slayer, while it is not a bad manga by any means, I find it perfectly entertaining. I saw the movie in theaters and I enjoyed it. But Demon Slayer really doesn't have I think could actually use more time with its characters and can spend more time, developing its world. But it hits
Yeah.
those shonen beats to in such a precise formula that for the vast majority of readers this doesn't matter because the shonen formula itself is popular for a reason. It is good. It is entertaining. Havocbringer says, "Got to rewatch that FMA episode." Yes, you do. My big heresy is that I don't think the original Full Metal Alchemist is particularly good. I think that early on, the first 16 episodes of Brotherhood obviously were intentionally truncated because it assumed that the people who were watching it had watched the original Full Metal Alchemist. However, even then, I actually think it did improve on it in some ways because the original Full Metal Alchemist show kind of dragged. Also, I think that the philosophy of the original Full Metal Alchemist was not nearly as nuanced or interesting as the philosophy of Brotherhood, particularly the character of Scar. I would argue, and one day I might even make my own video or article about this, that the original Full Metal Alchemist absolutely butchered the character of Scar. Scar is a great character in Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and they completely missed the point of the character in the original Full Metal Alchemist.
Going back for a second to the challenging belief part, one of the major reasons that it works and people like it is it goes back again to that sincerity. How sincere are you in your beliefs? When it's very hard to find that in the West anymore. The closest you can come is the Captain America movies, for me, because
which were, by the way, by far the best Avengers movies.
Yeah, they're among my favorite. Them and the first two Avengers movies, definitely my favorites. In each one, Cap is challenged, and this ties back into the pulp part. Cap is challenged. In the first one, how do you be a good man and a soul? You've got to be a good man, not a great soldier, a perfect soldier. In the second one. And I don't know if you've seen any of his videos. Professor Geek points out that he's challenged. Where's your place in the world? Yeah, you don't. There's no room for all these old fashioned notions. And Professor Geek's point in his video, its clip, is that Bucky represents both the challenge, but he also represents what America has been put through. Cap is the ideals of America in one person. And he's been in suspended animation for 70 years. Kind of feels sometimes like that might be what actually happened. Bucky, along with everybody else, has had to suffer through these 70 years. And his loss of identity, his being controlled by others, represents this. And it's a challenge to Cap. And Cap meets the challenge. He meets the challenge, and again he meets it in Civil War. He meets it in Civil War where they.
In my opinion, Winter Soldier is. Yeah, I agree with you. In my opinion, Winter Soldier is the best of the Captain America movies, largely for that reason. I think that Civil War is a very good movie, but I think that Winter Soldier gets to the point faster, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's paced
but again, it's
paced more tightly.
Yeah. But it's this challenge. But it's a new form of challenge. And evil never takes a day off. Then the new challenge is now your values are causing all of these problems. What you gonna do about it? And again, you go back to Full Metal Alchemist. You go back to Zoids. You go back to 86. I don't know exactly when that one came out. But again, the character...
Like last season, 86 came out.
Was that this spring?
I think so.
Okay, good. But again, the challenges keep coming. Now, in most Western entertainment these days, when somebody gets their values challenged, they shift, they drop them, they change. This is what happens in Civil War, Captain America Civil War. Natasha shifts when she's challenged on this point. Your values are causing us problems. Now, there's reasons for that, and maybe we'll get into that in a minute. And Tony shifts when his values are challenged. He's in a bad place anyway, emotionally speaking. And some of that is, anyway. They shift when they're challenged. Cap does not. But in a normal story for the West, based on what the... I'm going to keep calling them the gatekeepers because there's so many people involved in it. It's the producers, it's the directors, it's the writers.
Yeah.
And the writers and the directors answer to the producers, and they answer to they're the ones who go and collect the money. So they're the ones they have to please. But they expect certain things to be done, and to be done in certain ways. So the writers here are under constraints that in Japan, the constraints are, does this serve the story? You have stories where they're all over the place. And the stories may still be good for what they are. They might actually be terrible. But for the most part, Horikoshi's vision is executed in the pages of the manga. It's executed visually in the anime. We saw, actually, with Avengers Endgame, that it can be changed here by what the studios want, what the producers want, what the gatekeepers want. Because in the original scripts, the Russos got into a fight with Feige and the rest of the studio saying, no, we don't want Captain Marvel in this movie. She's an 11th hour addition to the cast, and this is supposed to be their goodbye. We kind of don't need her. She's in the way. But Feige insisted on it, and they had to film 2 different takes on the film, where she has more screen time, and then the film that everybody saw where she has less. There might be a reason Thanos punches her off screen. In it, there is a effort. There's an effort behind a lot of the entertainment produced professionally through corporations these days to make the characters shift their values when their values are challenged, which is what happens with Tony and everybody who goes on Team Iron to an extent. Everybody who's an Avenger, War Machine, Black Widow, Iron Man, they shift when their values are challenged. This is what they want the heroes to be. This is not what the pulp heroes of old were like. Going back to Werehawk, there's a chapter toward the end where the heroine, Tirtha, has to astral project, for want of a better term, toward the place where they have to go. And it's been invaded by a dark one, which is, let's call him a minor demon for now. And he gets a hold of her while she's out of her body. Her companions have to draw her back. And they get her back and everything seems fine, but she's emotionally unhappy. And in the next chapter, she has a bit of a breakdown. She falls into despair. The 2 guys with her have to hold her down, or she is going to take her sword and kill herself. And they have to draw her back from the edge of despair that this demon is dragging her to. And he's dragging her to it because she realizes how imperfect she is, how many meannesses is one term that Andrea Norton used in a different book. How many weaknesses, how imperfect she is. And the demon's drawing on her disappointment with herself. And the guys have to haul her back. And it's a bit of a tug of war, but eventually one of the guys says something. and it sparks her back to life. She pushes through it herself and comes back to her senses. And she still wants them. Again, this is a bit like a shonen story with Deku just now in MHA, the latest chapters. No, you've got to stay away from me. I'm going to get you killed. This is what she says to the Falconer with her. And he's called a Falconer because his people fight alongside their warhawks, which are more than birds, but less than men. And she wants him and the little boy they rescued. She says, no, you've got to go away. I'm just going to get you killed. I'm bad luck. I'm dragging you down, which is what Deku just did in this last chapter of My Hero Academia. And they do the same thing that Class 1A does. We're not going anywhere. We said we were coming with you. We're sticking with you to the end. And you don't have anymore, except in rare occasions like the Captain America movies, where you will have a hero have their values challenged and they will come back stronger. Now, maybe they have to be dragged back kicking and screaming like Deku, but maybe it's more like in the case of Van and Zoids, where somebody says something and they snap awake and realize, wait, so-and-so is right, you're wrong. Where Kimberly says to, I can't remember the episode title, but Kimberly, it's when he says, we want you to create a blood seal here at Fort Briggs. You're a dog of the military. You've got to do it, says Kimberly. Did you sign up for this? Did you really think you'd never kill anybody? And he's probably expecting him to try and wriggle his way out of it or to pin him to the wall emotionally, like he pinned Hawkeye and Mustang and the others in the war in Ishval. And Ed comes back with, I was hoping I wouldn't have to, or that I would find a way around it. And it's not the answer that Kimberly's expecting. And this used to be something you would see a lot in Western entertainment. Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi. He takes one swing
the
at the
thing
Empire.
about Ed's response there,
Mhm.
what makes Kimberly such a brilliant character in his own right too, because I love Kimberly. I think he's underrated. Alexander has a great video on him. And he also explained, like in the video, Alexander's video, I think, kind of explained what happens with Kimberly at the end of the story. If you remember when he kind of flares up in the homunculus
Yeah.
stone, and it made it make a lot more sense to me. So I recommend the video if that confuses you at all. But even besides that, I love Kimberly as a character for that reason.
Mhm.
Kimberly has a weird virtue to him in that he is ultra nihilist, but at the same time, he is also like one of the most consistent characters in the story.
Mhm.
Kimberly is many things, but one thing that he is not is a hypocrite.
So yeah, but yeah, Kimberly is not a hypocrite. Guys, can you hear me on the stream? Guys? Okay, if you can. Yeah. But that's the thing, is that a lot of anime heroes, and it ties back in with the Pulp stories.
Hello, I should be back online.
Okay, good. But yeah, that's the thing, is they receive the challenge and they rise to the challenge. And actually, this ties in with the show 86, which just came out, and it's a little like, let me see, it's like the Hunger Games meets the original Star Trek episode A Taste of Armageddon, only it happens in Nazi Germany, which looks like France. A Taste of Armageddon is a Star Trek episode where two planets are at war, and it's the computers fighting the war. But Starfleet sends the Enterprise in to mediate the dispute and see if the planets want to become part of the Federation, I think. So, but they get there, they beam down to the planet, and everything's nice and beautiful. You can't tell there's a war going on here. They find out that the way they've been preserving their culture all this time is to have the computers fight the war. But when the computer says that such and such target was hit, instead of the place being blown up, the people who live in that sector report to disintegration chambers where they are killed. Nice, neat, out of the way. The culture still survives. All the buildings still survive. Life is good, right? Except that it's still based on genocide. The Hunger Games, of course, are a dystopia future for the U.S., where the country is divided into 13 districts, with the 13th apparently being destroyed. And children are sent to die in gladiatorial combat to punish the people for rebelling against the capital. 86 does both things at once. The Republic of San Magnolia is invaded by mechanical drones from the Empire of Gilead called the Legion. And their army is so flimsy that it's destroyed in the first day. The Republic, which is primarily the home of people called the Alba, who are white with silver blue hair, retreats into 85 districts behind a wall. And the people in the 86th district are all different colors, different ethnicities, different races from the Alba. And they are kept outside the wall in camps, much like the Japanese internment in World War II in the US. And then they are forced to fight the Legion, ostensibly to get their citizenship back and return to living inside the wall. And they are forced to fight the Legion in the flimsiest mechs the Republic could come up with, called Juggernauts, which is a laugh because they're smaller than the Legion droids. This war goes on for 9 years, so long that almost all of the adult 86ers, as they're called, are killed in combat. Now, by the point the series starts, it's the war is being fought by children, literal children as well as teenagers. And the Legion has started to adapt. They are technically only have a lifespan of 9 years, 2 more years, and the Legion is gone, right? Well, the Legion knows that this is a problem, so they've been compensating, and they've been getting smarter. And pretty soon, there aren't going to be enough 86ers left to keep them out, and the Republic's going to fall. The story revolves around the head of Spearhead Squadron. Spearhead Squadron, which is based out of Combat District 1 outside the wall. And it's made up mostly of teenagers, and it's led by Shino Nozen, known by the personal name Undertaker, because, of course, there's got to be a way to sell genocide. The 86ers are referred to as processors, and the public in San Magnolia is told, no, these are just machines. Nobody's actually dying. That's a crock. They just call the pilots processors. It's the same thing as in Taste of Armageddon. We've got computers fighting the war. Nobody's dying. It's all ethical. Well, nobody's dying because they don't consider the 86ers anything but pigs. The lead heroine, Lena, knows this is true, and she wants to do something about it. She wants to save the 86ers. So she becomes a handler, someone who guides the units of processors in their fight against the Legion. And so she tries to make friends with them, but she doesn't, and this is something one of them, not Shin, points out, she doesn't even ask their real names. She just go by their earned personal names, like Undertaker, Gunslinger, Laughing Fox. Once she's told that, and challenged on her belief, and told you're nothing but a hypocrite, she makes amends. She learns the pilots' real names, because she does want to help. She realizes that she is imperfect, and that her attempts at help were hypocritical, and that she should improve. Now, this is contrasted very interestingly with her only friend in the military, because nobody in the San Magnolia Republic has a problem. Nobody officially has a problem with what's being done to the 86ers. But her only friend is a researcher named Annette. And Lena is very determined. And eventually she goes to Annette for help to try and save her squadron. And Annette says, no, you've got to stop. It's not going to do anything. There's nothing we can do. And we find out that Annette's father was engaged in horrible experiments on the 86ers, because some of the 86ers have telepathy. So, of course, how do you study that? Well, one way is, once you've gotten as much data as you can as a living person, you take their brain out. Annette's father couldn't handle this, so he committed suicide. And now Annette has taken over the same position. It's a very disturbing scene in a hard-to-watch series, because you see Annette's eyes widen. She knows what she's doing is wrong, but she does not have the strength to stop doing it. She's convinced herself that there's nothing I can do, so why not just keep going along to get along? Lena comes back in the next episode or two with a plan to save her squadron, and she blackmails Annette into helping her. And Annette stares at her, and she says, you're the devil. And Lena comes back with, yeah, so are you. We're both the devil. And it's because there's nothing physically that Lena can do besides save as many of her squadron as she can. But she's going to find a way to do it. She's been challenged more than once with the indifference of Annette and other people she trusts in the military, and the indifference of the public. Even with her limitations, however, she finds a way to save Shin and the remaining members of the squadron, which is not something you would see very much in modern entertainment. They might have her save Shin and everybody, but it would be, oh, that's nice, we saved some, nothing's going to change. 86, things are going to change. We haven't seen the second season, but the manga is ongoing, so it's still coming through. And the last thing I'd like to mention is I find it very interesting. I don't know if you'd noticed this, Anthony, but one of the things the Japanese anime does really well, and we don't seem to have done as well in a long time here in the West, is the mad scientist trope.
I haven't noticed that. That's an interesting observation, though.
Yeah, if you go back to
I guess you're not wrong, though.
Yeah, if you go back to FMA Brotherhood, the most obvious one is Tucker. He combines, okay, spoilers. He combines his young daughter with her dog to make a chimera that can understand human speech and speak back. You go to
Yeah, that was
Final
probably the most famous scene of the original show.
Yeah, and it's a very powerful, very horrifying, very scary scene in Brotherhood. You go to, I don't know if you've seen any clips from the Final Fantasy VII Remake. There's one after Aerith gives herself up to save Marlene. And this scene takes place after the Sector 7 plate has fallen, where she is in the lab, and Professor Hojo, who, if you follow the game, you know his backstory, is trying to get her to talk. And he says at one point, "Would you like to see your mother?" And Aerith kind of perks up. Of course, you'd have to look at her under a microscope. And he proceeds to go into the most abominable raptures, describing how he has dissected and kept every last cell of her mother's body. The scene, toward the end of the scene, he is leaning up against the wall, the glass wall, leering at her in rapture over this horrible, horrible act. You watch the scene and you want to just make him go away. You want to either climb the nearest tree to get away from him or get rid of him because it's horrifying. And we don't see that. I don't know if Dr. Frankenstein qualified, the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. If you get that kind of vibe from him.
The mad scientist thing in America is often more neutral than it is negative. In Japan, it's almost always negative. I think the reason
and I think that's kind of related to culture.
Yeah. I mean, it can be implied from culture. I mean, you know, somebody point out, I wonder why in America nuclear power turns people into superheroes, but in Japan it turns you into gigantic fire-breathing monsters. What differences in nuclear energy could there be in the history of the countries that would make them imagine such differences? Well, I think it's the same thing with mad science.
Yeah, and I think it's got less to do there with the nuclear option and more to do with Unit 731, which was the Japanese human experiment. Yeah.
The horrendous human experiment.
Nightmare fuel.
And of course, if you want some nightmare fuel for tonight, ladies and gentlemen, the man in charge of Unit 731 got away scot-free, and like Richard Rich in A Man for All Seasons, died in his bed of old age.
Right. Yeah, nightmare fuel right there, and it explains a lot. If you go to Hojo is the one that stands out, but Tucker's another one. So Arata from Cabaneri of the Iron Fortress, he goes into the same kind of raptures over making super Cabaneri called NUE, N-U-E, which it It's disgusting, and they never shy away from pointing out that this kind of thing is horrifying and disgusting. And I don't know how many of the pulps lined up with this, but I think that's a very useful perspective on just how the pursuit of knowledge and the power it gives you can corrupt you. It's actually more akin to Tolkien's portrayal of Saruman in some ways. And I think that's a very valuable trope to adopt for modern writers here in the US. If there's anything that we can learn from anime, is that there's been a constant sharing since at least the 80s, possibly a little before that, between the US and Japan. Transformers, for instance, started out as a Japanese toy line, but it wasn't selling very well, and it didn't have a backstory until it got here, where Hasbro picked it up, and now we have the Autobots and the Decepticons. That was our addition to a Japanese product. Similarly, you have Japanese adaptations of Marvel comics, like Marvel's Avengers Disc Wars and Marvel's Future Avengers, where they take something and add their own perspective and sincerity to it. It's a mutual sharing that has probably gone on throughout the world through all time, but it's very valuable, especially today, when we've lost a lot of our own sense of sincerity, to have a reminder from outside that we can learn from and pick up on from. And I think that's what shows like 86, Zoids, the Avengers anime, Full Alchemist Brotherhood, and all the rest have to give us is, okay, you seem to have misplaced your moral compass in the room here somewhere. Well, the light switch isn't working, so here's a flashlight. And that's kind of where anime, I think, is a visual version of pulp storytelling based off of pulp magazines, manga, that is very helpful today.
So the absolute best thing, in my opinion, about Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood and the story that it told, or at least one of my favorite parts about it. By the way, if my microphone sounds differently, it's because I gave up and connected to my phone. I don't know if you could tell or not, but that's where I'm at with my computer. Anyway, one of the absolute best things about Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is that people, I think, will unfairly claim that Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is anti-religion, when I think that that's an oversimplification of what the story is trying to say. Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is anti any unthinking philosophy, and in fact, it has just as much negative to say about the philosophy of scientism, which is the philosophy of the new atheist crowd who were
Yeah, I think you're right on that. And I would say, too, with Havoc Bringer, about Bleach. Yeah, sorry. I think you cut out there for a second.
I did. What I was going to say is... finish saying, and I'll finish my sentence.
Oops.
Alright, I'm in. Alright, so... what I was going to say is that one of the absolute best things about Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood is that Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood was very anti the philosophy of scientism, specifically. Like, which, for those who don't know, off the top of their head what that is, that was the philosophy of the new atheists in the mid-aughts, the mid-2000s, and it was very popular amongst a group of people for a time, It was the belief that science can solve all questions of all things morality. It can not only solve what it's actually intended for, which is as a system to solve empirical questions, but it can also be used to solve questions of morality and questions of philosophy. And using the scientific method, you can gain all knowledge that you will ever need about the world. This is the philosophy that Ed follows at the very beginning of the series, and it is a philosophy that Hiromu Arakawa strongly challenges when we are introduced to Shao Tucker.
It's a philosophy that he abandons by the end of the series.
Yeah. Shao Tucker is supposed to be the foil to Ed. He is supposed to be what Ed could turn into if Ed ever loses his moral compass. So, and theoretically, Shao Tucker is following the exact same philosophy that Ed is following, which he points out to him and which Ed realizes, which is what makes Ed so upset. That's why Ed, I think, is the main reason that Ed almost kills him and Al doesn't. Al is extremely angry as well, and Al
that's
was
why
very
he has
close.
such a bad reaction to him.
Right. Al was extremely angry as well, and Al has to control himself, but he doesn't have the same reaction that Ed does. The reason that Ed has that reaction is because Shao Tucker has hit the nail on the head. Their philosophies at that point in the story are essentially identical. They both believe that science is going to be able to solve all of the answers, but Shao Tucker has completely divorced it from all other types of knowledge so that even ideas of good and evil, good and bad, are gone. It's no longer a part of his calculus. Science is all there is. Hiromu Arakawa critiques this just as strongly, if not more strongly, than she critiques any sort of religious philosophy. Her point, I think, is less any anti-philosophy and more that she is against any philosophy that anybody enters into without thinking through its implications. He wants to make sure that
or that they use to serve only themselves. I'll just dip in real quick with Havocbringer's comment. Bleach has mad scientists among both the good and the bad guys. Yeah, there's mad scientists in anime that are not get it away with a pitchfork, like Hojo. Zoids has one. Dr. D, he's hilarious. But the difference between those type of scientists and ones like Hojo, again, is it comes down to morality. Hojo doesn't care. Tucker doesn't care. Morality does not, as you said, Anthony, figure into his calculus anymore, and I doubt it ever had any place in Hojo's life at all. But for Dr. D, he expressly says in the episode before New Liger that science keeps moving forward precisely because we believe in miracles. And he is quite willing to admit, I'm pretty sure this is what happened, but we never actually see him write down the physical equations explaining it. He just explains that, yeah, this is what happened. Do you think you could put that in a report? I guess his answer somewhere down the line would be, nope.
So I'll also say for the record, too, that this was actually a criticism of Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood that I originally had and that I actually retracted. When I originally watched the show, I never liked the episodes with Father Cornello. You remember him? He was the priest in the beginning of the show who was fooling the town, but with his fake religion. In retrospect, rewatching it and thinking about it later, I actually have a lot less of a problem with it because I think what she was really doing there was setting up the theme. The point of that story was not religion is bad and is a tool used to fool people. It was rather that here is an example of a philosophy that a town of people has accepted unthinkingly because they are promising to give them something that they want. And then Ed takes that as religion is bad and it fools people into something, into religion is bad and religion is the opium of the masses type thing. That's how Ed takes the lesson. But then Ed is challenged on this when he meets Shao Tucker, who is essentially doing the exact same thing. Science has promised to give him something that he wanted, so he is pursuing it even at the cost of everything else. Right? Just like the people, this religion is promising to bring their loved ones back from the dead, which is exactly what science is promising. Literally exactly what Ed is trying to get. Except that and Ed thinks as long as I follow science, then that's going to make it okay. And Shao Tucker is there to tell him, no, that's not enough. So,
Mhm.
in retrospect, I have less of an issue with the Father Cornello episodes because I think it's less that is the lesson that she's teaching and more that she is setting up the theme.
Mhm.
Uh,
I'd have to agree.
so we are at 9:18. We've got, and there were technical issues, so it probably lasted about as long as it normally does, all things considered. But I am going to end the stream here. Carolyn, thank you for joining. Before we go, tell us again about your story that's in Sursova, right?
Yep. Lupus 1, an adventure on the moon, where you have mechanical biomechs, known as mechanicals, that the Lunar Rangers use to patrol the moon. One of them happens to be running his beat when he notices flashes of lightning off on the mountainside. He goes to investigate and finds himself embroiled in a war between a Greek goddess and a Greek witch. If you like Zoids, you might want to pick this up.
It sounds like it'll be a lot of fun. Thank you. And thank you again for joining. So for next week's show, I am not 100% sure what they'll do, but I have an idea. If any of you have ever watched Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast, where he talks about historic events and things that he finds interesting, it may end up being something like that. Ben is probably, not definitely, but probably going to be on vacation again, so I am afraid you're stuck with me. Sorry about that. Hopefully, we'll have the technical issues more worked out next time. Truthfully, one of the reasons that they weren't so worked out this time is because we are trying out new systems and things to get them fixed, and since Ben wasn't here this week anyway, we thought it might be a good time to try and work with OBS and whatever, and that didn't work out so great this time. But I think that we had a good stream overall in the end, so have a nice night, everybody. And goodbye.